Assalamu alaikum. Can you hear me? Inshallah ta'ala, we'll give it a few minutes to start until people gather. Please let me know if you can hear me. Can you hear me? Okay. Can you hear me, Mohammed? Okay. So you are the problem. Inshallah ta'ala, we'll give it a couple of minutes and we'll start. Just one more minute, inshallah, and we will start. Okay. Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. Alhamdulillahi Rabbil Alameen. Wassalatu wassalamu ala Sayyidina Muhammadin Nabiyil Ummi. وعلى آله وصحبه ومن اهتدى بهديه واتبع سنته إلى يوم الدين. I bear witness that there is none worthy of worship but Allah, and I bear witness that Muhammad sallallahu alayhi wasallam is the last and messenger of Allah. Okay, of course, today probably everybody knows that we are talking about the theory of evolution, and evolution has been presented as the explanation for the existence of man and even his behavior. It is described as rational and scientific. Its strength is often presented by the number of scientists who accept its evidence in nature, meaning it's always presented as 99% of scientists accept it as a matter of fact. It is taught in schools and universities as credible and promoted in mainstream media as the standard. It has even seeped into the culture where some of its phrases are used, such as fight or flight. When you talk about yourself, you know, I was in a position of either fight or flight. These are actually Darwinian terminologies and explanations of certain situations. So it even seeped into the mindset of the average person. And of course, this powerful promotion of this theory is in contrast to those who do not believe in it, as presented. They are normally presented as irrational, they're backward, they're ignorant, as even Richard Dawkins, who is a biologist, professor of biology, and a leading person in atheism, in the fight for atheism and anti-religion, etc. So he said, basically, if you meet somebody who claims not to believe in evolution, that person is either ignorant, stupid, or insane. So what we want to do is to go through a little bit, in the theory of the evolution, and to find out, is this true? Is it true that the people who do not believe in it and the people who raise questions about the theory of evolution are ignorant, or are they stupid or insane? So we need, to start by explaining the theory of evolution. So, and when we say the theory of evolution, there are multiple theories of evolution. Theory of Darwin's theory of evolution is really the most prominent, the most widely accepted. The fact that there are other theories, it means that it's not complete consensus amongst the scientists, but this is the most prominent theory. So I will try to simplify it. And of course, simplifying it is going to be challenging. Challenging because some of the language that's used is complex and sometimes really is convoluted. You have to scratch your head 10 times, go back to this definition, that definition, just to understand what are they saying. Aspects of the theory, change and get revised. So what you could see something, if you read something, let's say in the 30s, it's not necessarily in 1930s. It's not necessarily adhered to or accepted today. So some aspects of the theory change and get revised. And the other component, or the other reason why it is challenging to simplify it and to present it in a few words, it is the vast, wide differences of opinions amongst scientists themselves and amongst the details of the theory. Where sometimes they question the experiment, sometimes they question the interpretation of the results of the experiments. So it is, on the whole, as evolved theory, that part is many scientists agree to it, but once you start digging deeper into it, you will find a very huge range of opinions within it. So what is Darwinism, or Darwin's theory of evolution, and what are the cornerstones of this Darwinism? It is a biological evolution. It's a view of a biological evolution, and it is defined as a process. So the evolution is a process whereby life arose from non-living matter, inorganic, and subsequently developed entirely by natural means. Now, this is basically to summarize, in one sentence, how the scientists view the theory of evolution. That it resulted from non-living matter, that there was a development or evolution, progression from one form to the other, and this progression was by natural means. And when we say by natural means, it means not directed. Now, not intended, not planned. There is nothing behind it that gears this development, this evolution, this progress from point A to point B. Now, of course, there are some scientists, again, we get into some scientists who believe in directed evolution, or there is a intended evolution. So they do not deny the idea of change in the living organisms, but they believe that there's something behind it that pushes it in a certain direction, something or somebody behind it that pushes in that direction. But for the general community, of scientists, when they talk about evolution, they mean it originated from non-organic, meaning from non-living matter, and it evolved and gradually. And the third, by natural means, meaning random mutation, random changes that took place to this unintended, unplanned, unfostered, and then you resulted from, this complexity of life, resulted from a simple form of life. So, which means that basically, if we say that we all originated from an inorganic material, it is singular, etc., we are basically all related. So humans, oak trees, hummingbirds, whales, everybody joins back into what Darwin called the family tree, and or the phylogeny, which is that all of us they come from one common source, one common foundation, and one singular cell, and from there we evolve to, or we move on and we branch out, etc. So it's a family tree sharing the same origin, same source, and then of course we branch out over the millions and zillions of years. So and his theory is very, very simple, really. So he observed that there is a variation in all species. So meaning, so if he comes to a certain species like canines, you know, and he comes and he sees some of them are slow, some of them are fast, some of them are big, some of them are small, some of them are darker color, some of them are whiter or lighter color, you know. So he sees that he observes that there are differences in them, and so he reasoned, and when we say he reasoned, it means that this is now his hypothesis. He comes up with this premise that since food supplies are short, how did he determine that they're short? That again, that's his hypothesis. Since the food supplies are short and they could not provide support for all of these organisms that are born, then the ones who have the better chances of being consistently or surviving and reproducing, etc., are the ones who are fitter, the ones who have the advantage in their variation. So now those who are more fit to survive and to benefit from with the scarcity of food, etc., they survive and they reproduce, and of course the weaker ones will just wither away, will die, and the stronger ones will remain. And now those will transmit those traits of strength, those traits, those characteristics that allowed the original one, let's say the parents or the predecessors, you know, it allowed them to survive. And of course, that variation, that move from here from the strong to down, you know, giving the variation to the offspring, that happens at random. That is at random. That is the selection of nature. Okay, but it is done again over a great period of times, and the great changes actually might occur. So Darwin's theory then was used to explain why finch, certain bird types, beaks, look a certain way, the horse hoofs, the distribution of life around the globe and through the ages. That was actually viewed from the prism of Darwin or Darwinism. And of course, the theory even was stretched. It was stretched to explain the human behavior, you know, as we mentioned before about the fight and the flight. So but they explained, why do desperate people commit suicide? Why do teenagers have babies out of wedlock? You know, why, certain groups do better, express more intelligence in test taking than other groups, etc., etc. So why do people tend to be religious? Why would they even forsake reproduction or reproducing and getting married and having marital relations, etc., for the sake of religious conviction? Why did they do that? Well, within Darwinism, actually, an explanation was presented. So the claim that's made, is that all modern organisms descended from ancient ancestors. So evolution is, in reality, then, consequently, it is responsible for all these remarkable similarities that you see across life, and of course, at the same time, the amazing diversity of life itself. So Darwinism explained life, explained the very existence of the human being. So, well, how did Darwin reach his conclusion? Remember, Darwin lived in the, around the 1850s. So when he wrote his book, it was about 1859, I think, when he published it, something like that. So he's talking about the mid-19th century. The level of knowledge, the level of science, the level of discoveries, the level of sophistication in the tools was the 19th century, level. So he based his findings based on observation and as well as dissection. So he would take certain animals, certain species, birds, etc., dissect them, look at the way the bone structure, etc., and observation. He went into long journeys, studying different species and looking for similarities and differences to come up with his hypotheses and later on theories. So he found similarities among living organisms, and he found some differences, and then he concluded that they all came from one common origin. Okay, but they came from one common origin, but into cumulative changes, a little bit of time over a long period of time. So when I say long period of times, I mean billions and millions of years, hundreds of millions of years. And of course, so the nature allowed, the beneficial traits to remain and the others to die out. Now, and as I said, these traits or characteristics were passed off to the offsprings. So for example, when you talk about, let's say, natural selection and the natural traits, so you'll have, for example, a bunch of giraffes. The one with the short neck, would not be able to reach the high, the trees, high trees to eat, and therefore they will tend to die. The ones with the longer neck will tend to survive, and of course those will pass the genes of long neck to their offsprings, and that's how basically nature, organized it, or allowed it to take place. So now, and again, to emphasize, that these changes were not according to some plan or system, but rather natural, i.e. random. And when I say random, if anybody's watched the debate of Cross with, it was a physicist, with some other, one is a biologist and the other a historian or a philosophy of science, PhD in philosophy of science, and basically Cross made a reference saying that, of course it is not random, it is directed evolution. It's a directed evolution, and of course he received an open letter, from one biologist, says you need to learn your biology before you debate a creationist. Why? Because it's not directed, it's at random, literally random, blind choice, and that's how the accumulation, or that's how the progression takes place. So now Darwin, back to Darwin, he published his bigger theory, regarding the variation of animals and plants in his theory Pangenesis. He called it Pangenesis, where the hypothesis was that nature makes changes in living organisms. This being produces small living units. This is how is it being done? The living organisms produce small units called gemmules, which can be transmitted sexually to via relationships with the opposite sex, and then it passes on to its offsprings, etc. Now, of course, Darwin did not discuss, what you're passing on, where did that come from? What is the first living organism that had such traits to be passed on? That was not in the calculus of Darwin. So that is left as a wide open hole for for anybody to want to poke at the theory. But so he believed that by the way, like others, and if you just that mindset, again, back to his level of knowledge in science and what exists around his time, he believed, like others, that living organisms can actually result from inorganic matter, meaning non-living items. So, for example, there was a common myth around his time that insects actually they develop from leftover foods. If you leave food for a while, eventually, somehow, from this non-living object, you're going to have a living organisms. Of course, that was refuted, as we'll come to see, actually around even before his time and after his time. But the components of his theory, here are the just major components of his theory that I mentioned. A living organism formed from non-organic source. That's the first idea. So, and this was, of course, by the way, I mean, it was refuted by Francisco Redi 2 centuries before Darwin, and also 5 years after Darwin, Louis Pasteur, who published his writings 5 years, in his writing, he showed that insects did not come from leftover foods, but they came from external source, not bad food. So basically the idea, his premise, or the starting point for him, that living organisms came from non-living, objects, that was actually destroyed around his time. It was debunked around his time. The other second component was that nature gives the living organism new traits. Nature, through this random mutation and blind mutation, it gives them new traits. So in other words, they would change from one type to another based on what nature gave them. And again, this was refuted by Gregor Mendel, who's known as the father of genetics. And this, by the way, was also around his time. He proved that regardless of the changes in traits in fathers, so if the fathers have certain traits, the characteristics will not go outside of the father, what the father already has. Meaning what you're going to pass on, the new traits for the children, for the offsprings, they are not going to be different from what the father produced. They are going to actually, those who are going to be from within the same lineage, the same genetic make of the father. So this is the first one, and the second. So the first one was about life from inorganic or non-living matter, and that was debunked. The second is that nature gives living or new traits. So in other words, what your father had, you do not have, and now nature gave you a new trait. That was also debunked in genetics, by more than one scientist. And of course, later on, it became also debunked by epigenetics, which proved that the environment can influence the activation or deactivation. It activates, it influences activation or deactivation of an existing genetic trait, but it does not add or does not initiate a new one. So this is a done deal. This is the second component that he had. Then they have the third point is that the acquired characteristics, because remember, you are supposed to pass on some acquired characteristics. These have to be inheritable, meaning not all traits are inheritable, so they have to be inheritable. So August Frederick Weismann, who was a German evolutionary biologist, died in 1914. He did an experiment on 901 mice, and what he did over 5 generations, he did an experiment where the idea of if you modify, mutilate the first generation, that trait is supposed to be carried over to the next offspring, the next generation. So he ran his experiment on 901 mice, and what he did basically, and over 5 generations. And what he did was he cut the tail of the mouse. Okay, so he would cut the tail of the mouse. That's a trait, a change in the trait, a change in the characteristics. And the idea is that eventually you keep repeating this, you're going to come up with a mouse that has no tail. Yet, as really Weismann had predicted, the descendants of those amputee mice, still came out with tails like normal mice. So, and he used that experiment, by the way, the results, to frame a comprehensive argument against the possibility of the acquired characteristics. So even that idea ran into problems as well. And finally, the fourth pillar of Darwin's theory is that nature chooses and selects the complex structure without any intention, without any direction, but randomly. And we will address this shortly, inshallah. Okay, so let's go back now into what did they rely on? What is the major proof that Darwinism, the idea of evolution through natural selection, that we all originated from one source, one cell, and that cell kept on multiplying and becoming more complex until we reach what we are today. So the main proof for them is what the genetic similarity. The genetic similarity. So meaning that we share a similar DNA. So as Dawkins claimed in one of his interviews, he says that this is the biggest claim. And he talked about the genetic tree of life, what Darwin actually drew, that there's a genetic tree of life. So, but here is what happened when that theory or that claim hits, microbiology and microbiology. Michael Savanian, he's a Harvard professor of microbiology and genetics. He says, quote, the tree of life is no more. It's no longer a tree at all. It is a totally different thing. So what did Michael Savanian do? He compared amongst 2,000 common genes amongst humans, frogs, and other living organisms. So he took, there are common genes between frogs, humans, and other organisms. And of course, they're common. So you would expect some commonality in the DNA, some commonality in the genetic structure. So he compared 2,000 genes, amongst them, and then finally determined that there are fundamental genetic differences. Fundamental genetic differences. So the idea that we all stem from one place and then we branch out, that actually, from the point of view of microbiology, did not pan out. In 2009, January 22nd, 2009, the Telegraph reported with an article heading that says Charles Darwin's tree of life is wrong and misleading. Claim scientists. That's the end of the title of the article. Now they cited the French biologist Eric Baptiste, and who's got a PhD in biology and philosophy of science from Sorbonne, and an evolutionary biology biologist. So what did he say? He said, for a long time, the Holy Grail was to build a tree of life, because the idea you're looking, and contrary to people who say there is no system and things at random, in reality, scientists look for nothing but system and patterns in the universe. Because finding an anomaly, finding something that's random, you cannot do much with it. We function based on systems and based on structures. So he said, for a long time, the Holy Grail was to build a tree of life. We have no evidence at all that the tree of life is a reality. Then he added, if you don't have a tree of life, what does it mean for evolutionary biology? At first, it's very scary. I'm continuing here, quoting him. At first, it's very scary. But in the past couple of years, people have begun to free their minds. Now, this is him talking about scientists. He's saying, first of all, there is no tree of life. There was never a tree of life, okay? And if we don't have it, what do we have? Well, what we built all of this science and research on actually is false. But now we're opening our minds and we're seeing something else. Richard Dawkins himself, in his book, The Greatest Show on Earth, The Evidence for Evolution, he claims that the DNA code for all living organisms is the same. And that similarity is the proof that they go back to a single point of origin. So he claims that, again, the common DNA, we have some common DNA and we go back to a single point of origin. But really, he was unpleasantly surprised when he met with Craig Venter, who is a well-known biochemist and genealogist, who founded the Institute of Genomic Research. And basically, he in the meeting, and it's on YouTube. Craig Venter said, the tree of life is an artifact of some early scientific studies that aren't really holding up. The tree of life, which Dawkins is basing his idea on, Darwinism is based on, according to Craig Venter, who is a biochemist and a genealogist and a very well-renowned scientist. He said the tree of life is an artifact of some early scientific studies that aren't really holding up. There may be a bush of life, so there is no tree of life. And in fact, from our deep sequencing of organisms in the ocean, out of now, we have 60 million different unique genes sets. We found 12 that looked like have very deep branching. Okay, but basically, you're talking about 12 out of 60 million, and you're talking about a biochemist comes and says that this is actually, there is nothing called tree of life. It is an artifact of some earlier scientific study. And really, Dawkins actually tried to push what are you saying, because that refutes what he's been proposing. But it is what it is, as they say. Now, of course, Darwinism went through changes. And a new term came about, which really many scientists don't like it to be used. They call it neo-Darwinism. And neo-Darwinism, just keep in mind, really, it's neo-Darwinism is it's Darwinism, and as we just mentioned about Darwin's theory of evolution by or through natural selection, the idea that there's going to be a mechanism for evolution. But the how, it's not. He did not know how that was being done. Neo-Darwinism is actually it reconciles Darwin's theory of evolution, with the natural selection, with the idea of genetics, and they reconcile it with the Mendelian genetics. So basically, because Darwin knew very little about genetics, again. That was what was at his time. And of course, Gregor Mendel, who was, very well-known genetics scientist, he is the one who talked about the traits that get transferred are not from outside of the cell, they're actually within the genes. In other words, no additional new forms, but still, when they combine the genetics with the study of the Darwinism, they call that neo-Darwinism. But actually, the distinction by many scientists is not really made. So they just use it as Darwinism still, and will continue with that use as well. So obviously, from what I just said, Darwinism has some challenges, and just to go briefly through some of the challenges that Darwinism has. One, mathematically, it's impossible. The National Academy of Science said that it questioned whether there is enough time for evolution, because the idea of randomness, which blows my mind, really, that they would insist that it has to be at random. It's not guided, because of course, if you say guided, then the next question is who's guiding it. So of course it has to be random, but then you run into the other problem is, what are the odds? What are the odds of having a mutation that goes, not only it actually changes, but it changes progressively from simple to complex, from, let's say, less beneficial to more beneficial, to the complexity that we are experiencing now. What are the odds? So actually, the National Academy of Science, it criticized the models, and they said that the math that they used to say, yes, it is possible, was questionable. And they said that they failed to take various complexities in the calculation. But for evolution to take place in the first cell, to the current state of living organisms, it requires a well-balanced set of laws and basic conditions, which, if subjected to the laws of probability, it's not possible within the age of the Earth. Meaning that, which is what we just said, if you're going to take it by probability, to take it from the single cell to simple, quote unquote, simple cell, to where we are right now, the probability for the time-wise, the age better than the age of the Earth, 3.7 billion years, they say, something like that. So that is not enough for this to actually take place. A Nobel Prize winner and an atheist, theoretical physicist, Wolfgang Pauli, criticized scientists for their lack of care when discussing natural selection, where they don't take the probability to produce the required changes for successful natural selection. Meaning what? He's saying that he criticized scientists, but he said they claim to be scientists and rationalists, but in reality they are very far from rationality, especially after using the word random. These are his words, without connecting it with mathematical probability in its implementation to another old word called miracle. We believe in supernatural events that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, the creator, gives to specific people to prove their prophethood, to prove their truthfulness, etc. And we say this breaks the norm. We say that this is abnormal, and there is no way to explain it but to say that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala bended, if you wish, modified the laws of the universe, to allow, one of his prophets to prove his truthfulness. So he's saying for them to claim that, and they are rationalists, They do not believe in metaphysics. They don't believe in anything beyond rationale and beyond scientific experiment, and they're all in the lab and all of that. He's saying that this is really equation, equal to a miracle. That you do not take the mathematical probability for it to take place. In 1966, by the way, Western Institute Symposium, was held, and it was in Philadelphia. It was in the state of Philadelphia. Now, in it was a summit, by the way, world-renowned mathematicians and other notable scientists assembled to consider the mathematical validity of the evolutionary process in 1966, Worcester Institute. So they met, and they showed it was mathematically impossible for organic evolution to have taken place. And I'm quoting here. He says, it seems to require many thousands, perhaps millions of successive mutations to produce even the easiest complexity we see in life now. The easiest complexity, it requires thousands, if not millions. It appears, they say, naively at least, that no matter how large the probability of a single mutation is, should it be seen as great as 1/2, 1 to 2 mutation. So mutation, make it even as large a probability as 1 to 2. You would get the probability raised to a millionth power. The probability goes to a millionth power, which issue very close to zero. This actually becomes zero, that the changes of such a chain seem to be practically non-existent. Mathematically, for you to come up with from a single cell to even for a few mutations, you're talking about practically non-existent. And this was said by Stanislaw. Now, another example, science demonstrated that for one enzyme, and that's a protein, for one enzyme or protein to evolve into another type, from one protein to another, not protein to human being, from one protein to another type, it would need 7 mutations. So how long does it need for these 7 mutations to take place? For these mutations to appear in bacterial pool is 10 to the 27th years. It's much larger time than that of the universe. 7 mutations of protein, and this, by the way, this is by people who are neither ignorant nor stupid, who are talking about this. Billions of missing links. That's another problem. So one is that you have the impossibility of the probability, and the second one is the billions of missing links. The idea of evolution is that you're progressing, evolving from one stage to the other. So in other words, between the one and the other, there's going to be some intermediate link. So if all creation, if all existence, all living organisms moved from that to the next level, to the next level, the next level, then you are not, you're expecting to see things, because that's what life is. It is not 1,000, not 100,000, not a million. It is billions and billions of living organisms which evolved, who evolved from the single cell, right? So you were expecting to see those billions of links, but actually, as Jeffrey Simmons wrote in his book, billions of missing links. You don't see the links. It's amazing that many evolutionary scientists, they celebrate when they say, oh, okay, we found an evolutionary link. We found this, it took us 150 years to find it, but really the point is not finding one. The point is, it should not be 1 and 10 and 100. You're talking about all that exists, all living organisms are supposed to be progressing, different levels, but they should be progressing, and that should indicate it, but actually that is not the case. And Darwin himself, by the way, recognized this in his theory, that it must be supported by archaeology. Darwin recognized that it has to be supported by archaeology, and that if no transitional links found, it would damage his theory. In his book on the origin of species, he says, the chief objections which might be justly argued against the views made in this volume, most of them have now been discussed. One one objection, one namely the distinctness of specific forms, and they are not being blended together by immutable transitional links, is a very obvious difficulty. So he's saying that if you find a specific form that does not have countless transitional links, this is an obvious difficulty. For him, it's a problem. Of course it is a problem, because archaeology has to support you. But actually it does not. So his idea of gradual evolution is not supported by geological history. So the NYU professor professor of geology, Michael Rampino, in his essay, which he wrote to Journal of Historical Biology in 2010, he said, and in fact, by the way, Rampino notes that more accurate theory of gradual evolution, Rampino's theory is not gradual evolution, but that there were periods of stable evolutionary status disrupted by catastrophic mass extinctions of life. So you're talking about sudden disappearance of life, not the weaker one dies, not the one that the nature did not choose, ended up dying. No, it's catastrophic mass extinctions of life. Now, of course, and he suggests another theory that is endorsed by another scientist, Patrick Matthew, that the idea is that it is the extinctions do not happen naturally, gradually, but rather happen catastrophically, and then, so basically saying the geological findings do not support it. And as a matter of fact, what was found later on, even not only that the fossils were not found not to support Darwin's theory, but the fossils that found weakened the theory even further. Because in other words, now the fossils that are found are, go against the predictions of the evolution. For example, Niles Eldridge, a biologist and paleontologist scientist, he wrote a book called The Myths of Human Evolution. The book called The Myths of Human Evolution. He's a scientist. He wrote his book, The Myths of Human Evolution, where he said, science has refuted Darwin's prediction about gradual evolution. Science has refuted Darwin's prediction about gradual evolution. And 120 years after Darwin's prediction, it has become very clear that the fossil records do not match what Darwin predicted. And the problem is not the extreme inadequate fossil record. The problem is not the extreme inadequate fossil record. The fossil records simply show that these expectations were false. So it's not that they did not find fossils. No, the fossils they found actually disprove Darwinism. Then, of course, added to this is the Cambrian explosion, what they call Cambrian explosion. And the Cambrian explosion is basically a sudden appearance of various multi-cell living organisms in one period. So one period of time, the Cambrian, by the way, was about 530 million years ago, 530 to 570 million. I've seen numbers range in between, but some 500 range, million years ago. And in the Cambrian explosion, and that's why they call it explosion, basically they found there was no progression. They found complex cells, multi-cell living organisms in one shot. Nothing to support it. And that was, by the way, found on the days of Darwin. So, and he was troubled by it. So he said the case, Darwin, and I'm quoting from his book, The Origin of Species, he said the case must be at present remain inexplicable and may be truly argued as a valid argument against the views here entertained. Okay, so he says that this is a case against my theory, and he could not, he could not give it no satisfactory answer. He did not have no satisfactory answer. And actually the issue is still pending till today. There is no satisfactory answer. And there were other explosions, meaning other areas where you have multi-cell, in other words, complex living organisms that just appeared suddenly. But not only that, you have also in the Cambrian explosion, you have much more complex parts appear, namely the eye and the brain, with no predecessors, no evolution before the eye was found, before the brain was found. So John Patterson, from the University of New England, said the complex eye appeared explosively and in a blink of an eye from a geological point of view. From geological point of view, and of course, this is how they cover themselves, from a geological point of view. So I don't want to say Darwin is wrong, but I'll say what I found. Maybe that's a way of to protect himself, and in a way that's accurate from his point of view. That he's saying from the eye appeared in suddenly. It was not a matter of developmental process. Now, Darwinism claims, Darwinism claims that the genome gets altered and added to. So anybody who wants to claim that to prove Darwin's evolution by random mutation, they must prove that the genome is being added to. That, in other words, whatever traits, whatever characteristics exist in the gene, that they are brand new. They did not come from some other gene pre-existing genes. And this is Michael Behe's theory or position. Michael Behe, by the way, is an American biochemist, and he's the author of Darwin's Black Box. And he serves as professor of biochemistry in Lee University in Pennsylvania. He's saying microbiology demonstrated that mutations help in some situations. Mutations occur and they help in some situations, but he says, but overwhelmingly, the mutations take place in genes that are there already. Not added, not new genes, not new information, nothing added to the existing genes, but to the same genes. And here is the very difference. The idea of Darwinism is to add, to evolve, to add more, to move forward. But he's saying, which Michael B says, this shows that the Darwin mechanism is devolutionary, not evolutionary. So in other words, what he suggests is that you are not actually adding new genes, you're getting rid of the bad ones, if you wish, quote unquote, right? And according to this, still we're talking about randomly, but it is no longer evolution, adding, it is getting rid of it. And actually he gives an example of a car. He gives an example of a car. So he said, if your life depends on the car getting to the destination, and you want to get there, you want to make sure that you have enough gas to get to the destination. So what do you do? What do? You don't add stuff to the car and you make it, try to make it go faster. So you want to make sure the gas gets you there. So you get rid of stuff from the car. You get rid of the hood, you can get rid of the doors, the seats are too bulky, get rid of them, etc. Just go bare minimum so that you can get, to your destination. So in other words, it is devolutionary, not evolutionary from the point of view of Michael Behe. Okay, so it's breaking down. In other words, from a genetic point of view, you're breaking down the existing genes, as some genes are for straight. For example, some genes are for straight hair and others for curly hair. You break down some of those genes for the other ones. This means that there's no cross mutation. You're not adding. You're getting rid of what already exists. A dog will always breed a dog. The dog will never become a giraffe. The dog will never, cross mutate and to become from a dog to become an elephant. Because again, the theory is we come all from the same source, from the same cell, single cell. Okay, so the gene sheds, the existing gene sheds what does not need for improvement, etc. But here, by the way, and once the gene that's shedded, that's gotten rid of, is gone, it is gone. It will not come back. So it's a one-way street, as far as the quote-unquote evolutionary process. Now, here's another main feature, and this is what I mentioned before, that we will talk about this before, later. Darwin's theory calls for random mutation with no order, no direction for evolution. Okay, so there is no system. It's just chaos, and out of chaos, something organized happens. Because the idea, we become more complex. That's more organization, and the fact that we function and we see and we eat and we digest and we procreate and all of that, all these complexities From all that chaos came this complexity. So now, from the point of view of science, it's generally agreed upon scientists that the world appears, underline the word appears to be organized. So Dawkins, biologist, and a chief atheist, he said, and in his book, The Blind Watchmaker, he says, biology is the study of complicated things. They're complicated, that have the appearance of having been designed for a purpose. So for him, an atheist, he said that they only have the appearance of being designed, being designed for a purpose, but reality is not. The believer, the people who believe in God, view that order is real. It's not just by appearance. For us Muslims, Allah Ta'ala says, "Inna kulla shay'in khalaqnahu biqadar." Indeed, everything we created with a specific measurement. Everything with the life, with the shape, with what it takes for it to survive, to function, to procreate, to eat, to digest, to breathe, etc., etc. Everything, inna kulla shay'in khalaqnahu biqadar. Everything is set with a specific, measurement. So the atheists say it's only by appearance. So all of this, the world around us, is simply, it appears to be organized, but in reality, it's chaos out there. Now, so the evolution here is all random, and that's exactly what it is. And of course, anybody who claims that the reality is different from what what we perceive has to prove it. So in other words, if you claim that no, it's not really organized, even though it's organized for me, everything we do, you see a system in it, you see a pattern in it, etc., from the universe to the biology, etc. If anybody claims that it's not the same, then they have to do what? They have to provide a proof. The burden of proof is on the people who say it's not, things are not what they appear as. Now, another point regarding randomness. Randomness cannot yield order. Randomness cannot yield order. So in the world of biology is nothing but a result of the result of order. Nothing in it, from the level of the cell, the level of the gene, the level of the components of the cell, nothing but order, and it is documented, it is put in place. Now, really, the idea that if you have something simple, you add it to something simple, you're going to come up with something that's more complex, without intention and purpose and direction, this is madness. This is madness. Nobody claims this. Nobody says, if I put 1,000 books that are, first grade level, written, first grade level, that they're written first grade level, and you put the 1,000 books, and then all of a sudden, you have Shakespeare, over 1 billion years, these are going to turn into, when you randomly fix them, you keep mixing them, all of a sudden they become Shakespeare books. It's nonsense. Or if you have musical notes, and you keep mixing them, and eventually you're going to get Mozart. Randomness and blindness, blind disorder does not give you order. One, really, one of the people who talked about the idea of randomness, he said it is similar to a bunch of blind people, and collecting junk pieces of junk, just anything random, because they cannot see. They're just picking up whatever they run into. So there they are, blindfolded or blinded. They walk around, they pick up garbage, and they go and they sit in one place. And of course, the next people, they do the same. And somebody uses it for X, somebody uses it for Y, whatever. Somebody uses whatever they collected to lean on, another person to cover themselves with. But there's absolutely no rhyme and reason. And of course, million years later, those pieces of material come out with a jumbo jet that flies, and goes, with all the system that requires for a jumbo jet. This is exactly what random mutation is discussing. It is chaos that does not produce system or patterns. And at the at the end of the day, random mutation or random evolution, whatever you want to call it, can only reject the notion of order and organization in the world of biology. Because when we talk about Darwin's theory, we are talking about biology, biological evolution. We are not talking about other evidence for God, the universe. So we're not talking about the physics. We're not talking about the other things that we talk about. We're talking about simply biology. So the best that they can do, if all of this is true, if all what they claim is true, the best they can do is just refute the idea of God from the point of view of, biology. And as I will mention, shortly, it doesn't even refute the idea of God. You have another point, the complexity of life, but I'm not talking about the complexity of life as in, what we normally hear, that, the way life is and the way the human body works. That is given, and that is a very valid point, for that. But we are talking about what really Michael Behe defined as irreducible complexity. Irreducible complexity. And by the way, even though he coined this term, but the meaning of it, even Darwin acknowledged. So what does irreducible complexity mean? Okay, Michael Behe says it is a single system. It's a single system. What is irreducible complexity? It's a single system which is composed of several well-matched interacting parts that contribute to the basic function, and where the removal of any one of the parts causes the system to effectively cease functioning. So when you say a reducible complexity, you have something that functions as a system. Any removal of any piece, you cannot reduce it. So if it has 7 parts for it to work, you have 5 parts for it to work, 2, I have 100, whatever it is. If you take one of them, it will cease to function. That's irreducible complexity. It has to remain. It has to be complex as such for it to function. Okay. So, and as I said, Darwin acknowledged this in his book on the origin of species. He said, if it could be demonstrated, that any complex organ existed which could not possibly have been formed by numerous successive slight modifications, my theory would absolutely break down. So again, he's saying the same thing. If you can demonstrate that there is an existing complex organ that existed without the mutations, without the numerous successive slight modifications, then my theory is gone. If you can show it, it's gone. Well, there are. We just talked about one of them, for example, vision. In the when we talk about the Cambrian explosion, vision was actually the eye was discovered, and it is a one unit, one system. You cannot take away any part of it, and if you take any part of it, it will cease to function. Coagulation. If you have a wound and the blood becomes dry, etc., that's another system that you cannot break it down. You cannot take any of its components for it to stop functioning. Even on a molecular level, on the level of the cell wall, for the cell to exist, it requires the DNA and the RNA proteins. And the DNA and the RNA cannot exist without the cell because they need a place to settle on the cell wall. In other words, there is interdependency. If you take any of them out, that cell will cease to function. That is on the level of the cell. In other words, they have to be formed, created, made, come to be, at the same time. So they have to exist at the same time for them to function. And this is, as Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says, هذا خلق الله فأروني ماذا خلق الذين من دونه. This is the creation of Allah. Show me what others have created. What others have created. This is, look at the eye, look at the cell. This is irreducible complexity, that you can find on many levels in various things. And of course, as Allah Ta'ala says, أَمْ خُلِقُوا مِنْ غَيْرِ شَيْءٍ أَمْ هُمُ الْخَالِقُونَ. Were they created out of nothing, or did they create themselves? Where did this kind of in the cell come to be? And by the way, it's really worth it. It's really worth 10 minutes of your time. If you just look at how the cell works inside the cell and how the proteins function, and you will see amazing things, just how they interact and how they function. where for anybody to say that this is just a random mutation, it is absolutely absurd. Another idea, another point against that challenges the idea of Darwinism. It is incapable. Darwinism is incapable of explaining origin of life. Where did life come to me? Yeah, we can claim whatever we want to claim, but actually, how did life come to be? So when you say the first cell, where did the life in the first cell come from? How did that come? We know it does not come from inorganic. It does not, it does not come from, where did that come from? Well, it is sad that many scientists would go at extreme lengths where it becomes absolutely ridiculous, to avoid one idea, and they mention you can come up with any explanation, and I read it in multiple places. You can come up with any explanation you want, but do not come up with that single explanation, that idea of there is a creator, because that's not scientific to start with. But watch this or listen to this, and this is actually this is scientific. There's something called, Francis Crick. Francis Crick is they co-discovered the shape of the DNA with James Watson, and he attended a conference, about the origin of life, and then he basically then he presented a paper, or he wrote a paper in 1973, and the paper was called Directed Panspermia, Directed Panspermia. And what is and of course he said, look, it's not a theory, it's far, but I urge you to take it seriously. He's saying, I urge you to take it seriously. And this was, by the way, it was presented first at the conference on communication with extraterrestrial intelligence, urging the audience to take this theory seriously. But then he wrote it in paper, which means that he actually takes it seriously. So what is the theory? He proposed that there are aliens. That could be that there is other forms of life out there, because after all, we have the billions of planets out there. There's got to be life somewhere, and what these living organisms and obviously more advanced because they came before us, they actually spread their on the earth and allowed life to come about. By the way, similar proposal came up by Richard Dawkins, where when he was asked in one interview, Richard Dawkins, when he was asked, could life have started from other forms from out of space? And he said, yes, it could have started there. So he could have started there, but could not have started by that. In reality, what they did, so instead of addressing, where the human beings came from and where life came from, now they just pushed the question to whom? To the people, or the living organisms that gave life to the people on earth. The question is, where did they come from? Who gave them the life? You have not solved the problem, because the problem has only one solution. You only move the question to another area, but it has not been solved. Now, and notice, by the way, all explanations here, all explanations about life, they all revolve around the material, the physical. They never revolve, or they never address other than that. Other than that, what's more than material? How about the mind? How about thought? How about consciousness? And these, by the way, these are big topics. You have people who are specialized in the study of thought and the study of consciousness. You have, for example, Michael Ingor, and he's a distinguished neurosurgeon and neuroscientist from Stony Brook University in Long Island. And he gave a speech about the and artificial intelligence and mind. And he mentioned an experiment by a Canadian neurosurgeon, again, Penfield, and he mentioned others, but for my purpose, I'm just going to stick to one item. Penfield, a neuroscientist and an epilepsy specialist. He performed open brain surgeries. And of course, probably everybody knows, open brain surgeries are done while the person is actually awake. So because there's no sensation in the brain. So they drill, and that's local anesthesia, drugging. And then once they open, they manipulate, they do their thing. So What they did was, and of course the patient cannot see what they're doing behind their heads. They manipulate certain parts of the brain, and they make the arm move this way, they make the leg move that way, etc. And but every time they ask the patient, why did you move your arm? They would say, you made me move it. You made me move it. You manipulated my brain to move it, even though they're not seeing it. Or they would actually move their arm on their own. They would know, they can tell the difference. They can tell the difference, whether this was physically manipulated or willingly, manipulated, meaning that it's by will. So it means, for him, that they recognize the difference. So the question is, how? How do they recognize the difference? Then he posed another question about, well, how come when we talk about epilepsy, there is seizures, the people, you see them losing control, and sometimes they fall on the ground, they have no control of their limbs. But he says, have you ever seen an intellectual seizure? Have you ever experimented in intellectual seizures? These are, by the way, neurosurgeons. These are well-distinguished neurosurgeons. They are not, talking in a coffee shop. So they're saying, have you ever seen intellectual seizures? Why? Because, have you ever seen people when they go on seizure and they start doing mathematical equations or contemplate the universe or talk about legal or ethical issues? Not at all. So they said over 30 years and tens of thousands of surgeries of experiments, etc., they could not find it and that makes conclude and not challenged by scientists, that intellect, the mind, is different from the brain. It's outside of the brain. And it is not material, because if it's material, we can manipulate it. We know where So what is the brain? The brain is the facility that facilitates the thought, the intellect to take place, but that is not a material thing. Really, another item, what about information? Information, we take it for granted. Information, if you have a hard disk, a computer hard disk, and you fill it with information, data, zeros and ones, it does not become heavier. It's the same weight, but the information is there. And the mind, is the same. In other words, where is information? So Norbert Wiener, who's a mathematician and philosopher from MIT, he says information is information. It's not matter nor energy. In the world of biology, it's a gene. It's not a gene or a DNA or RNA or protein. So in the world of biology, the information is not a gene. It's not a DNA. It's not an RNA. It's not protein. It's something else, not non-matter. He said information is conceptual, not matter. Without it, the universe is reduced to a dead matter with no system. And without it, nothing functional can function. Gene is nothing but a package of information. It's not a thing, and the DNA parts are put in it. They're but the medium, not the message. So you're talking about when the information exists in the gene, it's not the gene, it's not in the DNA. The DNA is actually just carries that information. So it is, where does the information, how is the information stored, and where does it come from? Paul Davies, also, who specialized in the science of information, in his book, in the beginning, there was information. He says, there is no known natural law through which matter can give rise to information. Neither is any physical process or material phenomenon known that can do this. Meaning what? Darwinism, the idea that it's actually purely materialistic and purely explaining what is, with all the problems that we cited, all the challenges that it's facing, but it's still dealing with the material. It does not deal with information. It does not deal with the mind. It does not deal with consciousness. It does not deal with any of that. Okay, but if we limit ourselves to materialism, to the Darwinian materialism, then we start asking questions. Really, what is a human being? What is a human being? What's the value of a human being? Stephen Hawking. He said the human race is just a chemical scum on a moderate-sized planet. We're nothing but a chemical scum. So all that we experience, all we are, all we thoughts, or our thoughts, or our emotions, or our our behavior is nothing but a chemical scum. That is actually a materialistic view, a Darwinian materialistic view. And of course, with the idea of Darwinism, when you talk about the impact of this materialist Darwinism, people are always at constant conflict, because remember, it's a survival of the fittest. It is the competition, to make sure that you are the breadwinner, you're the one who has the food in the scarcity of food, etc. And actually resulted from it what scientists call social Darwinism. Even though I did not see in any place where Darwin talked about social Darwinism, but it definitely applies, it can be derived from it, and some people did. So they applied the rules of Darwinism about the origin of species, by natural selection, to the preservation of favored races in the struggle for life. So most infamous result, of course, was the Holocaust. It was the idea of the white Aryan race is the supreme, is a supreme race. It is ahead in its development and evolutionary process, better than the others. And social Darwinism was also a major influence even in the events leading in the First World War. And you can feel, Google it and you'll see that there are actually many writings have been done on this, because they viewed that this is how you actually get the human race to advance. Hitler was completely in the thrall of biological evolution, and he thought his war would promote evolutionary progress. So it is not something that is far-fetched. As a matter of fact, even in and this was known, and you can also Google it as well, human zoos, where of course they viewed that the white is more evolved, more advanced than the black, the brown, anybody who's not white. And they opened human zoos where they put people who are not white, they are not developed, they are not up to the white person's level. They put them in zoos, and people were coming actually and taking a look at them in the zoos. And this is something that actually took place. So also from a Darwinian point of view, a materialistic Darwinian point of view, life is pointless and has no purpose. There is nothing. You are not living for anything. You are because you are. And you are going to die just like everybody dies, and you go into the dirt, and then the next generation comes, and that is life until, since everything is at random, until it's struck by some, heavenly ball of fire, and it goes to destruction or whatever, but there is no purpose in life. There is nothing that you are doing here on this earth. Now, as a matter of fact, you have also, under this view, you have no will, you have no choice, because you're nothing but, remember, chemical scum. You're nothing but chemical reactions. Dawkins, the very Dawkins, says that he only, in his book, River Out of Eden, he says that we are nothing but chemical reactions. Sam Harris says that free will is a fallacy, and that we are only a biochemical puppet. You're only a biochemical puppet. You're moving because of the traits in your genes. You're moving, you're thinking, you're believing, you're disbelieving, you whatever you do, it's because of your makeup. It's not because you have free will and you have random, you have actually a choice, and your educated choices increase with your knowledge, etc., etc. Francis Crick also had the same point. Look what he says. He says brain exists because evolution built the brain. Why do brains exist? Because evolution built the brain. And everything at bottom is matter. But when you think, you're not thinking. When you think, you're not thinking. But natural laws are determining your thought process. Natural laws. So you are nothing. You have no will. You have no choice. You are nothing but a chemical scum, and everything that you do is nothing but a chemical reaction. And of course, with that, where will the objective morality come from? What will we do with moral standards? There are no objective moral standards. Now, some people tell you, does it mean that atheists or materialists are not moral people? It's not that. We're not discussing individuals being moral or not. We're talking about moral standards. How do you judge something is good or bad? You want to see a sample of what the discussion that's going on? Richard Dawkins himself, when he was asked about rape, about rape, and whether it is accurate to say, there is not reason to make it wrong. There is no reason to make it wrong. Just like having 5 fingers, not 6. He said, you can say so. So there is no reason really to make this, act as wrong. It's just the way it is. Krauss himself, when he, in his debate with with Hamza Zorsis, he says that incest for him is fine, as long as it's done one time and, no children, because, it might lead to diseases or something like that. Sam Harris, he viewed that rape was natural at some point. It was not. Now he made a big point, and he published a big article about how he's being misquoted, etc. And he said at some point it was natural to spread people's genes, and it was natural, but not that it's good. He's saying it's not good, it's evil. He calls it evil. And again, we ask the question, on what basis did you call it evil? We call it evil based on an objective moral standard. We says, Allah Ta'ala, God said, this is haram, this is evil, this is, on what basis did you say that? Especially that, why would you punish anybody who is simply having some chemical reactions? He behaved in that way because of some chemical reactions. What basis did you, would you punish him, or to say that what he's doing is wrong? Simply your chemical reactions led you somewhere else. His chemical reactions led him into what you're calling evil. On what basis would this modern society is going to punish people if they believe that they have no will, they have no choice, they are simply chemical reactions? Is it really bad to commit a crime? And what is a crime if there is no moral standard? And why would you punish anybody since they did not commit anything wrong? They're just being driven by it. And the question is, why does he even criticize people who believe in religion? If we believe in God, why does he criticize people if they believe in that as a chemical reaction again? Harris, by the way, himself, he suggested throwing a nuclear bomb against Muslims to get rid of their evil. Evil? Why? With just all chemical reactions. You see where this is going. It's not going pretty. Does Darwinism negate the existence of God? I mean, we can talk about many negative effects of Darwinism, but does it negate the existence of the idea of the existence of God? First of all, biological evolution does not negate the existence of God, the creator. Because remember, Darwinism is talking about evolution. It does not talk about the origin of the universe. It does not talk about the origin of life. It just says it started with a cell, but it did not say where the cell came from. So as I said, assuming that all that Darwin said is true, holds true, one can argue that the creator has the will to create in whichever way he wishes. So he created and let them interact with each other, let people interact at random, and let the living organisms and things with nature happen at random until they reach the wherever they are reaching as a point of complexity. So there is no debate, there is no conflict between the idea of the biological evolution of Darwin and the idea of the existence of God. Now, where the conflict happens is that the idea of God as viewed by the books of certain religions. So by how the Muslims view God and view creationism and view, the life, etc. That by, the same thing with Christianity and other religions, etc. So that's where you might have run into issues. But the idea of creationism, which is fundamentally what we're talking about, the idea of creationism, it does not that. You can, as I said, God could make lower end, organisms and then allow them to evolve, to become more complex. That's just his will. And as a matter of fact, many supporters of Darwinism find no issue with that. Many supporters of Darwinism, and that's exactly what I'm saying, they find no issues with that, including Darwin himself, by the way, who wrote a letter to his friend Asa Gray. He was a scientist. He wrote him a letter where he said, on the other hand, I cannot anyhow be contented to view this wonderful universe, of especially the nature of man, and to conclude that everything is the result of brute force, even though this is really what he's proposing. He says, I'm inclined to look at everything as resulting from designed laws. Everything is resulting from designed laws. with the details, whether good or bad, left to the working out of what we may call chance. Not that this notion at all satisfies me. He continues, he says, I feel most deeply that the whole subject is too profound for the human intellect. You know, so for him, he is saying, I'm not even satisfied to say that, you know, I believe that's part of an order and organization. I don't want to say that it is at random. And but it could be that God made things this way and to organize themselves this way, and I'm not satisfied. But it is just too much to comprehend. So you have other examples. There's many scientists. Actually, one of them, Kenneth Miller, who was a microbiology scientist and a biology teacher at Brown University. He was a Catholic. He wrote his book, Finding Darwin's God, a scientist's search for common ground between God and evolution. And this is what I was mentioning before, that some people, creationists, negated or rejected Darwinism completely. Some of them because of the idea of random mutation, the idea of random. And the second group of people who try to say, well, it is directed evolution. And it is, yes, there is evolution. We see changes in the cells, but this is all not the way Darwinism depicts it, and, you know, where we all share one common answer. In other words, Darwinism modified, you know, but so that was a second opinion. But by the way, again, even National Academy of Sciences, which is a champion of Darwinism, in a booklet called Science and Creationism, it says, a view from the National Academy of Sciences. In the second edition, it says, many religious persons, including many scientists, hold that God created the universe and the various processes driving physical and biological evolution, and that these processes then resulted in the creation of galaxies, our solar system, and life on Earth, etc., etc. And they continue by saying, indeed, it reflects the remarkable and inspiring character of the physical universe revealed by cosmology, paleontology, and molecular biology, and many other scientific disciplines. So, in other words, really, when we talk about Darwinism, we should not feel that it is definitely, you know, against the idea of creationism and the idea of the existence of the creator. Now, materialists and people who negate it, such as Krauss and Dawkins, etc., you know, Darwinism is simply an aiding tool to explain, you know, how we got here. But it is not really their argument for the lack of the non-existence of the creator. As a matter of fact, if you remember from last time when we talked about the scientific method, scientifically you cannot prove something does not exist. You know, that's a statement, something does not exist. You can only prove something that, you know, that what is tangible. So you cannot say something that beyond the universe does not exist. You know, so it is there is no conflict from the point of view of creationism exclusively. You know, the one is talking about evolution of what existed from a cell and up, and with all the issues that we raised against it, and many people raised against it, and versus the idea of God created things. Why do then, if that's the case, and has many issues and people raising it, and the people who are raising it again, they are scientists, just as well-renowned, as world-renowned, as you know, Nobel Prize winners, as you know, well-known scientists. They say it is not the case. As a matter of fact, you have websites. You just Google them. You have websites about scientists asking for Darwinism to be re-evaluated because the evidence do not add up. And these are, when I looked at the names, you know, some of the names and the titles come with biochemists and biologists and microbiologists and people, PhDs and well-known people, you know, who are saying we need to take a second look. But then if it has all of this, why is it presented with such certainty, and at the same time the other opposite opinion is so much put down as if you're people bunch of, you know, hillbillies that you don't understand anything? Why is it that they're sticking to it? I can only, you know, I say what my understanding, but nothing really is forced. I can say that the environment of science itself and the academia around scientists fights anything that negates it, because it's institutionalized. And when I say institutionalized, it means it is part of the secular Western model of science to present science as godless. You know, because and if you go against it, as Michael B. he said, and as I heard it from other places, I read it in different places, people who actually were celebrated as, you know, world-renowned scientists, they lost their jobs, they lost their grants, they got fired from their jobs because they started saying that they believe in what they call intelligent design, equivalent to, let's say, that all of this is not random, it's not chaotic and leading to organized. It doesn't happen this way. Just simply by switching, they became, you know, they turned from people celebrated to people out of a job, and people who, you know, like they call them pseudoscientists, you know, etc. So they're willing to tolerate somebody who would, who would say, you know, about panspermia and people from outside of the world, they would tolerate that as a possibility, but never the possibility of that there is somebody who's they call intelligent. We say Hakim, wise, and Rabbna subhanahu wa ta'ala, who is more all knowledgeable of what he's created. But the other thing is that we have to understand who is leading all of this. The ones who are leading this is in the Western hemisphere, in the Western world, with a capital W. Their experience of God and their experience of the Creator is through the prism of the church and the history of the church, and the idea of dark ages, and the idea of the anti-scientists and anti-intellectualism and anti-scientism. So when we talk about bringing God into the mix again, you are talking about all these open wounds that Europe and the West in general, you know, took centuries to get out of, to move into where they are now. You know, now you're saying that we are going to reintroduce it. So for them, the idea of God, the thought of God, is a tainted word. It's a tainted thought. It's a tainted history, and that's why they need to stay away. And the other thing is that for a secular world, for a secular West with a capital W, for a secular West, if we scientifically, which is now the God of the time, if we say scientifically, science accepts that as even as a possible, you know, source or a possible cause for the universe. The question is, what do you do with this God? What's the role of this God, you know, in this world? What role does this God need to play? And these are questions that nobody wants to answer, nobody wants to get into, because if they get into them, it is just a rabbit hole, and they end up in again places that they do not want to. So it's very convenient, you know, to be at this point and stop here. And the problem is the very science that they are excelling in, and the very science that they're producing, is debunking the very theory that they're using as a tool to negate the existence of order and the existence of direction and the existence of intent and wisdom behind the world. So what do we take from all of this? Darwinism has many flaws in the theory, in the science, and I really tried to stay away as much as possible from the details of science, because it is easy to get lost. I have been lost for about a month researching it, and it is huge. It is an ocean in itself, and you can be torn to pieces between this scientist and that scientist, and this biochemist and this microbiologist, and so it is huge. But at this, really, this is the what I think is the conclusion of it, is that this is the process Darwin drew, and this is what the scientists actually held to. However, microbiology came and has shown many things to be that were claimed to be correct. It showed to be incorrect. Archaeology and geology has proven other things, to be incorrect. Neuroscience, all of this, all mathematicians all contributed to viewing this theory in a different light. And of course, the idea of science, the idea of information, and the idea of intellect, and the idea of the mind, etc. All of these are added to that, to say that Darwinism, if it explains certain things, it cannot explain everything. It cannot explain the existence of of life. It cannot explain the existence of the living organisms, cannot explain really well even, the function of the human being or the function of the various living organisms. So we say at the end that Alhamdulillah Rabbil Alameen for the ni'mah of Islam, for the blessing of Islam, because we do not have the conflict between mind and science. We know where Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is, and we know that He subhanahu wa ta'ala created everything. And this is what often some scientists claim, here you go. It is, you always say, God created and therefore, there's nothing to do. And actually this is far from the truth, as we mentioned in when we talked about scientism and the scientific way of thinking. We said that actually to say that God created it, this is the basic understanding of a human being. This is something that's innate, and this is that's what the human being reaches rationally. But this does not mean that we do not explore, and we do not understand, and we do not look for the magnificence of the creation of God, and to learn and to better improve the world and the universe that we're living in. So we say Alhamdulillah for the ni'mah of Islam, and that just addresses the issue of Darwinism. And inshallah ta'ala, next session, inshallah, we'll talk about the idea of, I believe, God and the problem of evil. And that is a total different subject, inshallah ta'ala, that is used also to negate the existence of God. Does anybody have any question or any question? By the way, Darwin does not say that we came from monkeys, or but we said that we share some genes with apes. But the idea is, that does not simply, just to simplify it. But that it's really, if you think about it, as I said, we're all cousins in one way or another, you and the oak tree, because we came from non-organic, and we developed into what you see now. And so all of us at one level or another are related to each other. So that's his theory. And as I said, you find many scientists who are finding problems with it, and it should be reevaluated without being ideologically motivated. In other words, if I'm going to reach, I'm going to make sure that I reach that Darwinism is correct, regardless what science shows. It is nonsense. Science, the most basic step of science, when you approach it really with no prejudice. You approach it and let the facts take you where you are. If I do not find billions of missing, the missing links, if I don't find the links between the evolutionary organisms, then I say, there are none. If I see an explosion of, animals that with no predecessors, then I have to state that. And if I say that, well, Darwin said, if you find a complex system with no predecessors, that blows up my theory, and I find it, that blows up your theory. It is what it is. If we're going to be, really sincere when it comes to science. But if we have a prejudice and we approach it, then what's the value of what we're doing? Well, yeah. Inshallah, if anybody has any questions, please feel free to send it, or to put it, post it online, inshallah ta'ala, and somebody will get back to you, inshallah. سبحانك اللهم وبحمدك نشهد أن لا إله إلا أنت نستغفرك ونتوب إليك بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم والعصر إن الإنسان لفي خسر إلا الذين آمنوا وعملوا الصالحات وتواصوا بالحق وتواصوا بالصبر وآخر دعوانا الحمد لله رب العالمين جزاكم الله خير السلام عليكم